So essentially, the case of the Boggy Creek Monster, also known as the Falk Monster, named for the little town of Falk, Arkansas, which is in the southwest corner, close to the border of Texas and Louisiana. Um, Starting back in around the 1930s and 40s, people began reporting sightings of a hairy, scary Sasquatch like creature lurking in the Sulphur River bottoms there surrounding Falk. And those, for the most part, were not made public. It was just something that people talked about in those days. And keep in mind that back then, the term Bigfoot or any concept of Bigfoot, especially in Arkansas, was just unknown. Well, that kind of culminated into the early 1970s, in which sightings did make the newspaper and the Texarkana Gazette, which sort of ignited this sort of wave of reports and older stories coming forth. And that inspired a would-be filmmaker by the name of Charles B. Pierce to set out to make what started out to be a documentary, but ended up sort of this docudrama horror film called The Legend of Boggy Creek, which was released in 1972. And the movie was just sort of the right time, the right stuff. I mean, back in the 70s, right when Bigfoot and stories of the Loch Ness Monster and then, other things, Chariots of the Gods, all that stuff was
Mm.
coming out. This was perfect. And it was the way it was done, it sort of reenacted the sightings that people had reported. And so it was very scary, and it was, in the woods of Arkansas, and played in the theaters for years and drive-ins and on TV. And that film made like $25 million, which was totally crazy because it's basically just a low budget, Arkansas movie. But anyway, so that really elevated the story of the Falk Monster and essentially a Southern Bigfoot type story to a whole nother level that well beyond newspaper reports and such. So it became quite famous and later influential on people at the time, young people who were getting interested in studies of the strange world.
Mm. And did you have interactions with the director? Was it Seth Breedlove?
Charles Pierce.
Oh, what am I thinking of?
Well, Seth directed the documentary
The
we did.
documentary. Okay.
Yeah, so Seth is the new generation, I guess, of Charles Pierce. But
Charles Pierce.
uh,
Okay.
yeah, Charles Pierce, unfortunately, I never met him. Right about the time I started doing research, which would become the book, The Beast of Boggy Creek, he was quite old and in poor health. And so he died in 2010. And it was just, I mean, just the timing was not there. And unfortunately, I never met him. But I've since become close with his daughter, Pam Pierce, who ended up doing the restoration process for the movie. But unfortunately, I never met him.
So, I mean, of all of the legends of Southern Bigfoot and or even just Sasquatch in general, people like Lauren Coleman have cited this as one of their main inspirations. Why do you think this particular case and this legend has such an impact?
I think, in addition to the time period in which it was released, I think the way the movie was made um, just hit the right notes because the way they sort of showed the real, in many cases, the real witnesses and sort of reenacting the encounters, which were quite dramatic and some of them were quite scary. Um, it would, later you kind of look at shows that have come on cable television, Finding Bigfoot and things like that. And basically, they are doing what the Legend of Boggy Creek did so many years earlier. They interview the witness, they kind of do a reenactment, and people love the stories. So I think the way it came across is more, rather than just a horror film that was just fiction or hyping up the Bigfoot, it really showed that these are real people and they saw something that was extremely strange and unexplainable. And that kind of triggered that investigative sort of vibe that guys like Lauren Coleman and even cast members of Finding Bigfoot cite this movie as that inspiration.
So the Boggy Creek case book begins in 1908 up until the present day. Well, the book came out in 2020, I think. So we're talking about well, 9 decades of cases. I think, what are there, 90 cases in the case book?
Right. There's about yeah 90 reports and some going back. The first mention I could find was around 1908, and of course, back then it's those things weren't logged or recorded. We had no internet. There was no way to report a Bigfoot sighting. So unless the newspaper happened to pick something up, it was just sort of recollections from some of the old timers in Falk who would say, okay, well, I remember somebody saying something about it. So I kind of sussed those out through either interviews or mentions in the newspaper that would talk about those old sightings. And that's the thing. During the process of research myself, I was surprised at how far the sightings went back, and also that they had continued. Because I think the general thought was everybody saw this and thought all this happened in the early 70s, and that was kind of it. But there really is a longer history, and as it went forward in time, you get to the 50s and 60s. Well, now it's more in current memory, so there's more sightings to be had or stories to be recorded.
And do you think? Well, let me ask you this first, and then I'll ask you the second part. Are there similarities in the sightings or commonalities? I mean, going all the way back to 1908. In other words, is there a consistency here in the description of the Boggy Creek Monster?
Yes, I do think there's a consistency, and I think that to me lends some credibility that it wasn't just some sort of flash in the pan type thing. People have reported the same type of creature, and it would be described as something that stood 6 or 7 feet tall, covered in hair, had the ability to walk upright. And that was something that was surprising, because back in, say in the 40s and 50s, people had no concept of Bigfoot. So they would often say it looked sort of like a gorilla, but it
Mm.
walked like a man. And a lot of them said it had longer, sort of shaggier hair. And, you do see those commonalities throughout, the majority of the sightings, which to me, wasn't people just making up wild stories.
Right. That was my second question about the fact that the cases go back so far, and then there is this consistency that just lends credibility to the whole story. How many of the 90 cases were you able to actually, I don't know, kind of track down and investigate for yourself?
I would say probably at least a third of those that I was able to speak to somebody, in many cases, the first person witness, and in a few cases, perhaps the son of a woman who had a sighting back in the 60s or something that, was no longer with us. And it was quite a chore, really, to track down all those sporadic newspaper reports. And luckily, I spoke to a a gentleman that runs a historical museum in Miller County, Arkansas there, and he has an interest in this. Now, whether he was kind of on the fence about the reality of the creature and such, but he felt very much like this is of historical value, and it certainly is, because if you go to the town of Falk, that's just, I mean, it's so known for that.
Hmm.
Uh, So luckily through him and others, I was able to sort of get these people to talk that wouldn't have normally spoken about it or just kind of kept it to themselves and their family or just in the general Falk area. Um, so luckily I was able to, to interview people. And in some cases, some of the most dramatic sightings that have occurred in the 80s, 90s, and on, where I had a witness to interview and sometimes gotten to know their whole family. That really, for me, was the thing that convinced me something is really going on here.
Can you share one of the, let's say, one of the more exceptional eyewitness accounts that you investigated?
Yes, and there's so many of those. One that really stands out to me, and one that when I started going up to Falk and kind of getting to know the locals and research, several people had said you need to talk to this guy Terry Sutton, whose family has lived here a long time, and Terry is a guy that everybody believes is a trustworthy guy who had a really kind of frightening experience when he was younger. So I actually found his father, who still lived in Falk, and told him I'm writing a book. And he told me the story, and then later put me in touch with Terry, who had never really told anybody about this. And he said that this was back in 1981. So by this time, of course, most people know the Legend of Boggy Creek and guys who lived there. It might be in the back of your mind, but you kind of were like, okay, whatever. He's a young teenager. Well, their property backs up along the Sulphur River, and there's a lot of woods there. It's a big chunk of private property, and they have a pond on it. And Terry was fishing there one evening, and as he was fishing, he heard something kind of walking around. This was February, so there's some leaves on the ground, something crunching around. He heard some strange noises, which he thought the neighbor's bull may have gotten out and gotten on their property. Well, he's fishing, so he's very, very quiet. He's just sitting there on this pond, and then he hears footsteps crunching through the leaves, and he thinks, who it's either my dad or nobody is on our property. People didn't really traipse across people's properties, you know.
Mm-hmm.
And so he said, as he was sitting there, he heard something that came up over a small embankment and was walking sort of. He could see it from the side, and he said, "I was maybe 60 feet from this thing." He said, "I was sitting there, and it didn't notice me or see me or turn its head." Um, and he said it was walking upright. It was covered in hair, a bit hunched over. He said he was about 6 foot tall. He said it looked as tall as me or taller. And he said this thing was absolutely unbelievable. He saw it, it's getting dusk, but it's enough light. He said the thing walked up and then walked over another bankment down into a ravine and never noticed him or looked if it did. And at that moment, it sort of was everything was just the reality of this of, oh my God, I literally just saw, I guess, the Falk Monster. And he said, just the chills that ran over him and then the fear. So he paddled to the edge of the pond and jumped out and kind of made some noise. And he heard the footsteps stopped, and he waited there, and then he heard the footsteps kind of take off running. And at that point, he just ran for the house, and was met by his father. He was just in a panic. But the credibility of his story and the fact that he had never really shared with anybody, he was unsure. People don't believe you. And getting to know his family, I absolutely can tell you, I can't prove what the guy saw, and we can't say exactly what that entity is, but he absolutely saw something, and it's something that's unexplainable.
Well, over the years, I'm sure you've developed kind of a BS meter. I think I have. When you're talking to people about their experiences, was he? Did he get emotional? Because I would imagine if this really happened, I mean, that would potentially change your whole life, have you question everything, and you might even exhibit, you know, signs of like PTSD or something like that. PTD, sorry, post traumatic distress syndrome. Anything like that from Terry Sutton?
Yes, he did. You could see just sort of that emotion of reliving this. And when I interviewed him the first time by phone, and then when he came down, he had since moved away from Falcon, but he came to Falcon and was able to interview him on the property by the pond. And that further reinforced for me, you could see that emotion, and he was just sort of um, it was you could tell that this was a an instance in life that did play this pivotal role of just he questioned what could be out there. And again, those kind of things, especially with the BS meter, I mean, you tend to be able to get a feel, but when you can meet the people in person and especially go over the sighting, I'm like, that's just, if all the other sightings I ever interview people about are BS, that is enough right there. That one right there to me says, okay, it wasn't a person in a costume and it was not a figment of imagination. What was it?